Loving versus Virginia was such a landmark case in U.S. history, and its effects can still be seen taking shape today. Despite such an incredible ruling, people's cultures didn't change as quickly as the ruling in the courts did. For example, in 1990, still 63% of non-blacks were against any of their close relatives intermarrying across ethnicities. And I think Alice Childress attempted to speak to this lack of immediate cultural change by her decision to continue to publish the play even after Loving versus Virginia had already been decided. By 2015, these statistics have significantly improved, with nearly 1 in 5 couples being intermarried, significantly higher than just the 3% of people in 1967. Not only has the African American community been adversely affected by Loving versus Virginia, but also the Asian community, with nearly 30% of newlyweds being intermarried. And for those who were born in the United States, it's even higher and closer to 50%. Another influence that Loving had was that it gave the federal government control over the ability to review state domestic relations in order to ensure compliance with constitutional guarantees, something that previously to Loving had been left up to the state's discretion, which gave way for the anti-miscegenation laws to take hold. Overall, Loving can be seen to have had long-lasting cultural effects that are still developing, and the commonality of interracial marriage and acceptance of such a marriage seems to be steadily increasing across cultures.
The Honorable the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States.
In my research of Loving versus Virginia, I first started analyzing the modern representations of Loving. Everything from movies to plays to novels, even a French novel I found. But then I moved on to the legal objection to Loving v. Virginia. I realized that although the decision from 1967 was unanimous, today we might not see such support for the arguments laid out in Loving v. Virginia. In 2013, U.S. v. Windsor had a very interesting dissent written by Justice Alito. The arguments almost parallel what would have been the narrative for the opposite opinion of Loving. First off, the Supreme Court lacked the jurisdiction to review the case, and that for the interests of the Federal Uniformity Congress had the authority to enact the Defense of Marriage Act, otherwise known as DOMA, was the first topic brought up in the dissenting opinion. The second point, the majority opinion did not address whether or not the Equal Protection Clause required laws that restricted the definition of marriage to be reviewed under a national basis. And the third, and most unique to me, was the right of homosexual marriage was not deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition. That's a direct quote from Justice Alito's dissenting opinion in 2013. I think that it's very obvious that these are very similar arguments that would have been applied to the Loving v. Virginia case had this same Supreme Court heard Loving v. Virginia today.
Alice Childress wrote Wedding Band in 1965, but it wasn't performed until 1972. In the interim, the Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia was decided. So why write a play about an issue that had already been settled by the Supreme Court? The answer to this question lies in the influences on Alice Childress's work. When looking through her personal papers as published by the New York Public Library, Alice Childress makes it very clear that she wrote for the people in her community and her family, not just professional actors. Also, many of her works were written for church groups, civic organizations, and other organizations that Childress felt were important. Childress wrote this play to change the hearts of people, not just the law. Childress also followed in the footsteps of many great playwrights, like Arthur Miller, who were subject to FBI investigation. Childress herself was investigated for her civic involvement, especially in the theater, and some supposedly communist groups. It is undoubtable that Childress took cues from Miller and other authors who used their art to speak out against government silencing of artists. Childress's play then welcomed a new era of civil rights by changing not just the law, but the hearts and minds of the people who had to follow it.
I define myself as black. Anything else to me was blasphemy. It was an expression of self-hatred towards your own African ancestry. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I actually started to challenge that.
A person's identity is fundamental to who they are as a person. It is the way that we define ourselves and is tied to our beliefs, characteristics, and life experiences. In my research, I found that both the play Wedding Band by Alice Childress and the case Loving v. Virginia show a deep-rooted conflict between a person's legal and personal identity, as well as the negative effects of these forced identities on people. Identity is something that only the individual can define, yet under the racial integrity laws, the state of Virginia attempted to define the identities of its citizens. These laws were put into place in an attempt to protect the identity of whiteness against what many at the time viewed as the negative effects of race mixing. In these laws, a white person was defined as a person who has no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian. These laws not only defined what it meant to be white, but they also defined what it meant to be black. The Third Act, passed in 1930, defined blackness as being any person who has even a trace of African American ancestry. These laws forced a legal identity onto people that leaked into their personal lives in a way that was not only intrusive, but was also restrictive. The racial integrity laws created a social stigma around interracial marriage that has had a deeply negative effect on the way that society views these marriages and the lives of those in these marriages. Many of the people interviewed in the documentary, The Loving Generation, We Are Family, discussed the struggle between the different sides of their family when it came to their children. The black parent would be focused on making sure that their child understood the fact that society would view them as being black even if they had a white parent, and their white parent simply could not understand the way that society would view their children because they themselves have never experienced it. These laws and society have forced this identity onto those that they label as black, and even after the Supreme Court labeled these laws as unconstitutional, these identities have continued to stick around. These children would have legally been black, and even after these laws were dismantled, mixed children continue to face the after effects of these laws because society still identifies them as black based on the fact that they have a black parent. In the documentary, The Loving Generation, Checking Boxes, one of the men that they interviewed discussed his experience of deciding to identify as mixed.
They were all mixed. It was really weird because I realized I had never been in a group of mixed people before. And that kind of changed everything. Like after that, I kind of came out of the closet as a mixed person, which like looking at me should be obvious, but was still like really upsetting to people. You know, friends I had didn't understand and thought that I was, becoming like a sellout, running off into the desert and deciding I'm white.
What was interesting about my research is that it revealed that while there used to be a legal reason for society's forced identities, after Loving v. Virginia, the racial integrity laws were labeled unconstitutional and took away this legal reasoning. As a society, we are now upholding these forced identities, and we are the ones that have created them. This means that the way to dismantle these identities is for us as a society to take the steps needed to dismantle this mentality that has become so ingrained in the way that we as individuals define ourselves.